Hey y'all, you're listening to Risky Behavior, where no subject is off limits. Sit back, tune in, and enjoy a beverage with us as we explore controversial issues and answer your health and wellness related concerns, ranging from nutrition and exercise to sex and prescription drugs. I'm here with co-host Dr. Shetha Chakraborty, who's a national media risk expert, as seen on CNN, the BBC, Fox News, and more.
But don't just think this hour is all science as usual. After 4 seasons as a regular guest and food scientist on the Dr. Oz Show, Dr. Taylor Wallace, who the Huffington Post calls the nation's premier food and nutrition guru, together he and I will loosen lips and spill tea with special guests that you will not want to miss. So we're going to jump right into today's guest. We're really thrilled to have with us Joe Britton. Joe Britton is here after spending a considerable time as a someone in politics, not career politician, someone in politics. And his most recent position was with Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico. Since then, he's left, not politics, but he is now focusing his time and attention on launching his C4, which is called the Business Climate Initiative. And it's all about making some real policy progress on all things climate change, because we know that is not an easy feat, especially not in America and in this climate. So, Joe, you are that person that mutual friends have described as the one name everyone knows. And it's not just because it's a common name. It's because it's your name, Joe Britton.
A lot of Joes out there.
Thank you for being here. We're thrilled you're here.
No, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So tell us, what really prompted the move? What made you leave politics even though you love it as much as you do?
Well, largely the lawyers. I was given guidance that I couldn't go
no,
further.
But who loves the lawyers?
Yeah, there was ethics laws that I had to actually go out and break free from the asylum, like I've told you before, but go and on the outside figure out, whether or not businesses were going to buy into this. And at some point it's asking about, lending them my talent, but also asking them for their credibility and their resources. And I couldn't do that while I was still like a federal employee. So the time had come.
So this is really for your own C4 organization, your 501c4 organization. It's not because Trump's president and you really just wanted to get the hell out?
There was actually a lot of fatigue, I'll tell you that much.
Okay.
I mean, I think
we're in kind of a stop, drop, and roll kind of environment these days.
The federal workforce, I think, of all stripes is struggling in some ways. I think it's a tough environment.
I love when you have people who have recently left their position in Washington because they can actually talk very honestly about what it was like. But, we appreciate you being very upfront with us, and we understand the fatigue weighs in, but that hasn't stopped you from wanting to go back. It's the timing, right? And it's about what value you can really add. And it's the passion that you exude about the value you can add, especially as it relates to climate, is palpable. So let's talk about that. What is it that you want to really do and see happen back in Washington?
So we don't have a policy gap when it comes to climate change. We have a political gap. So I think we have all the solutions in the world, but convincing Congress to do it is kind of the challenge. And I firmly believe and we're at a juncture where the climate activist community has had a lot of success. People are paying attention. Businesses are trying to figure out how do we respond to and meet the needs of this younger generation of our workforce. And they're trying to figure out, how do we show leadership? And they'd like to, I think, put that energy somewhere. And I think that's where I see the biggest opportunities to bring the business community into the fold and align them with all of the young folks that have made the biggest difference, I think, in the last couple years.
Well, and that's essentially what your new organization it's focused around, is getting industry riled behind, beginning to solve some of the aspects of climate change.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And also to close that gap between all of these disparate movements, which are, like you said, the activist movements going on, and then you've got what are the motivations and interests behind some of these companies that are doing it. Can we tease out the ones that are really doing it? Like a Microsoft, for example, that's trying to make their operations already are neutral, in fact, and trying to get to carbon negative, versus those that are just doing it to check the box, Like a lot of these companies don't want to be seen as not part of this upward trend towards sustainability efforts. And they, for that reason, how do we really responsibly integrate all of that range of intention into the ultimate end goal, which is moving that needle forward?
So I think a lot of the companies are struggling because and they have an interest for a lot of different reasons. One might be retail. Your Coca-Cola, you want to be able to tell your consumers that you care about climate change. Some of it might be labor market, where you're competing for the best and brightest out of business schools, and you want to be able to show that your organization's values matches their values. It might be liability. It might just be a pure legal question. So your PG&E, which was the first kind of climate bankruptcy. So as the climate worsens, your exposure worsens. Then you have people that it's, strategic market advantage. You might be Vestas. You might be Pattern Energy, where if we have a carbon price, we're in a carbon pricing environment, your business is positioned well. And the other is, I think there's a lot of this out there. There's people that have made their money. They're in the boardroom. They're CEOs, and they want to pass on a world that is got a brighter future than our current trajectory. So I think that's kind of where people are, and they're struggling to figure out, do I want to just get credit where I'm trying to keep protesters off my back, or do I want to solve the problem? And I think that's there's plenty of people, I think, fulfilling the, hey, you give us money and we will thank you publicly and say that you're great on climate change. But in a work environment, the corollary I would make, we all have worked with somebody who didn't work very hard and didn't do very much, but was really good at pretending they were doing something.
Right.
Like, it's not durable. People figure that out. And so I think there is there's a, I think, momentum to see real change and to see companies really step up. And there's a lot of them integrating their supply chain and decarbonizing, throughout every contractor and vendor that they have. And Coca-Cola has actually done a pretty good job of that. But we also need them to help our entire economy make that same shift.
So as somebody who's kind of moved from, public service to more of the, nonprofit, like private sector side of things, I mean, do you really think that we can get industry riled around this? Is this is activism enough, or with your experience, is it going to take policy and incentive to really move companies forward?
So I think the kind of protest, movement, the activist movement has really galvanized the business community's attention. Like, they have it, and these companies are worried. And I would put, JP Morgan Chase as a prime example. They kind of have it that they're in a really tough spot because they represent major financing for some carbon intensive capital investments.
And get better soon, Jamie Dimon. He just underwent emergency surgery.
Oh God!
Yeah.
Oh man! But they're also in some ways sitting ducks because they have so many retail operations. There's a Chase Bank on every corner, and so the protesters are really going after JP Morgan. So I think they're a prime example of somebody who really needs to get out from under this rock and show some leadership. And they just made a big announcement a couple weeks ago. So they're trying. I think there's companies that want to do better, but what I think ultimately need is for them to be politically engaged, because you can have a fly-in where you fly in and you lobby Congress for a day and you take a picture for the newsletter,
right,
and then you put that on your social media page and say, hey, look, I care about climate change. Or you can have a full-time campaign. And the way that I describe it is, if you're a business and you're the Chamber of Commerce, for example, and you want tax cuts, what do they throw at it? Everything. It's, grassroots, grass tops, digital, social, paid
right,
media, earned media, the whole spectrum. So if we want Congress to act on something, we have the recipe, we know what works, and it's all of that. It's not go and take a picture once a year and say that you care about climate change.
Well, and the reason I ask is Shetha and I this last week actually went to this really lovely event at the Swedish Embassy, and we saw the Swedish ambassador speak about what they're doing in Sweden from a policy perspective to really incentivize companies. And, I found it really interesting that a lot of industry has moved to Sweden, and their industry is growing very rapidly because of their policies and incentives that they give to companies that are really investing in producing less carbon and having a less environmental footprint.
So let's talk about that. What is from the government, and how does the government incentivize industry versus, we've been talking about industry incentivize, or the different motivations that industry has to act in a way that is amenable to overall, societal, global, planet warming benefit. But what can government do? And is that really the essential, that's the fundamental point you're making, right? Is we need to get government there.
Yeah, that's a good point, because, many of these companies they're really setting aggressive targets, and they're doing the right thing within their own supply chain and their own operation. The key is, which is great, I mean, those, I don't begrudge them at all. I mean, they're doing the right thing. But ultimately, we need their leadership because we're stuck in this rut when it comes to politics and climate. We don't have the votes. I mean, I've talked to a Republican last week who was a leader on these issues and cares about them. He literally told me that he didn't think in our lifetime we would have a price on carbon. So, like, there's a lot of people that care, that see this as way off in the distance and out of reach. I'm actually pretty aspirational about it in the sense that I actually think if you think of all the big movements that we've had, it is a coalition. It's a culmination of activism. It's partnership with institutions, Congress being a key piece of that, and everybody working together. I mean, I oftentimes make the corollary of gay marriage. So, like, in 2004, and this was an abrupt change, and there was actually like it took 10 years to do it, but in 2004, Democrats lost horribly on abortion and gay marriage. In 2006, it was a midterm election, came roaring back, and we haven't talked about it. I mean, there's obviously disagreement and other things, but politically, it's not really part of campaigns anymore. The Republicans gave up on it, and we're like going to argue about something else. That's what my hope is about climate change, is that they have an interest. Like, I think their voters are moving ahead of them. What we need is for everybody to kind of come together and say, listen, let's depoliticize this. This is good for the country. And then we can argue about other things.
Taylor, I know you're excited about getting married, but you need a boyfriend first.
I know. You know what? When the Supreme Court struck down and started to allow gay marriage, you know where I was?
I don't know if I want to know.
My best friend Stephen and I, we were eating at the Chick-fil-A, girl. True story.
Our producer, Brandon, is not pleased by that, as somebody who identifies as queer himself.
I said nothing.
So you're in a unique position to show how you create this war room kind of mobilization,
Yep.
which is how you put it. As somebody who is fascinated by what you do, and we've had many conversations about this, that was enlightening to me to hear, because you can actually treat this as that kind of extreme mobilization that's worked for different social issues in the past. Why don't we just put that together? We've got the recipe. You've described it so well. Like, all the elements are there. We just need to create it. So what is our biggest challenge? Why aren't we? What has been the biggest challenge?
Well, I think the business community is struggling with this. You know, they worry about backlash. They know where the public is. The public is way ahead of Congress, which is normally where they are at. And they're struggling to figure out, like, how do I show real leadership? And there's some sensitivity, like, they don't want to offend the president, right? They may not want to offend the majority leader in the Senate.
We don't care about that here on the show.
But that's the thing, is
We're neutral, we swear.
but they're looking for, like, you know, they've got shareholders, right? They're publicly traded companies. They're big organizations. And I think they're looking for a safe space to make a real difference. And, you know, is it always going to be safe? No. Sometimes leadership in some ways is going into unsafe territory. And that's really what I'm going to be asking the business community to do, is, like, lend me your credibility and lend me your resources.
But in regard to something like climate change, and we saw a lot of activism, particularly when AOC came out with the Green New Deal, is it a bad thing that Congress moves more slowly than people? Because, and I say that because, you know, I look at some of these activist groups. I mean, you know, just recently, you know, the girls that jumped behind Joe Biden and screamed, you know, let dairy die or whatever it was.
Oh my God.
It's kind of like, really, everything in this country, and that's what you got to get on national TV and run behind a presidential candidate and scream?
Yeah.
Like, you know, it's kind of like, okay, activist groups, can we focus on, like, what matters? Because, like, you know, you're mad at ice cream, and that makes no sense right now.
Human endeavors create weird results sometimes. Just the way the world works. But I mean, I think what we need is, you know, the Congress needs to respond to the public. The people are ahead of them. And I think the nice thing about what we've seen in the last couple of years is young people are going to grandma and grandpa and dad and saying, listen, this is something we got to do. And so, like, it's starting to trickle up. You know, you don't hear a lot of trickle up sometimes, but it's starting to trickle up where people know they've got to do something, and they're trying to figure out, how do I do the right thing? I know it's the right thing. How do I get there?
Yeah, because the older generations have comfortably just been like, oh, you guys will figure this out. This is your issue. I've heard from so many Gen Z and whatever is younger than that, because they're coming out of the womb these days, like, ready to scream about climate change, which I'm not angry about. I'm very happy about. But it's incredible, the age demographic and the enlightenment that you see, that just, you know, moving down that chain. But how do we convince bottom up, right, the lower demographics up to those who are still in power, that they're the ones who cannot sit back on their laurels, right? Rest on their laurels. Did I just use a really American phrase?
Very American. Old
Where did
and
that
American.
come
Very
from?
old and
That
American.
came from like
The 70s, the
yeah,
60s.
like
That's
US,
not even in my dictionary.
that's like junior high school U.S. literature. Anyway, so the whole point is there's a lot of conflict back and forth that happens between younger demographics being like, come on, okay, boomer, right? Like, come on, why don't tell us that you can't do anything about it? And then older generations looking back and being like, this is your problem, you'll solve it. We need to get over that hump.
We do. I think, the interesting thing to me is that everybody sees in their community something that's climate related. They may not know it. In Nebraska, where I grew up, there's this whole movement of, I'm not a climate guy, but, which is, you're a farmer. Like, you don't identify as an environmentalist, but you've had 3 100-year floods in the last 5 years. And you know that you haven't been able to go in and plant soybean until June, when normally you're getting it in May.
This
Like,
is your problem,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, exactly.
So,
How
like,
do we frame it?
Yeah, so it's like socializing for people. What you're seeing in your community is a climate issue, and you can do something about it.
Right.
Okay, so on that topic, because it's interesting in terms of framing, how do we describe these situations to people to make it relevant for them? And I think that's also, Joe, why you and I have talked a lot about how to best present some of this stuff.
Yep.
And to get different stakeholders, whether it's the private sector, whether it's politicians, whether it's like their unique constituencies, excited and invigorated by it. You just present the information in certain ways. So that was a long-winded way of explaining how sometimes taking the security angle, especially with parts of America that don't really want to hear about climate change and the activism that they associate with it, if they hear about the security implications, the national security implications around climate, then all of a sudden you have their attention.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we were talking earlier about, so Ray Mabus was the Navy Secretary under President Obama, and he figured out that we were spending so much time and resources just creating the fossil fuel supply line in theater. So we're in, this is conflict. These are professionals, but they spend so much time delivering oil and gasoline into like conflict zones. And that was the number one threat, was these big tankers rolling through Iraq. And so they were scrambling to figure out, like, how do we have, like, we are so tethered to this liquid, right? We're so tethered. It runs everything that we do. And their biggest vulnerability in a war was the actual supply line of fossil fuels. And so so I was talking to Alex Lasky. He was the CEO of O-Power. He recently sold and is starting this thing called Rewiring America. And he's basically, they've gone and they've taken, it's DOE funding, but they're doing analysis. And one of the things that was, to me, like eye-opening was, not only if we decarbonize and have a fully electrified economy and grid, not only do we have a clean energy, we're actually using basically half the energy we otherwise would have. So 10% of the energy that we use is inextricably linked to extraction, processing, and delivering other fossil fuels.
Right.
So you
Think
get
about that. Exactly.
10% right off the top.
Right. Right. So we don't have to suffer the way. So Germany was a leader early on in terms of sacrificing, quote unquote, sacrificing to reduce energy consumption as countrywide. And so you heard a lot of stories that Americans then took and ran with negatively, unfortunately, because they were like, we know that Germans, as much as they appreciate and recognize the importance of what the consumption and needing to reduce consumption, they're sacrificing like how often they have their lights on and how much AC and heating that they're allowing in their homes. And Americans' response, being Americans, being the consumer nation that we are, we're like, we are not Germany. We are not, we are America. We like to consume. We like our gas guzzling.
Yeah.
We like our
I stay in the Four
SUVs.
Seasons and
We
I like
our-
my heat.
We know you do, honey. Damn.
The lights on. I think I left the lights on when I left the house.
So, but the point is that how do we paint this picture of a future where we're not actually, we're not losing out, we're not sacrificing, because it's going to be hard to get Americans who are so consumption oriented to say, yes, I'm willing to give up. And this is a huge plug towards those outside of the US, especially Europe, especially Germans, who I'm personally thankful that that type of consumption behavior exists. That's probably what we should get to. But to be realistic, we are not a nation that is willing to sacrifice in that way.
Yeah, and in some ways, like, should we be sacrificing in some way? Should we have some consumption adjustments? Probably. But that's not like what I don't think climate action is. We don't need to do that. So, for example, there's this, if we were to have a fully electrified, transportation fleet, if every American had an electric car, and I don't know, is that 10 years, 20 years down the line? Who knows? But what's crazy to me is if everybody is plugging in their car, it then becomes a part of the grid. It becomes grid resiliency. And Alex was estimating that if you just use 10%, if everybody just used 10% of their battery from their Tesla, from their Volt, from their Leaf, whatever it is, that would run their household for the day. So we have this ability where we can use these are like substantial. They're highly advanced batteries. We can use them to power everything. It could be our washing machines. It can be the lights in our home. And I think the estimate was that because sometimes people talk about resiliency. Oh, we need coal or we need this because otherwise the grid is going to go down and we're not going to have electricity. In this environment, the fully electrified environment, if we had nothing, no energy at all, nothing coming in, we could power the grid for 3 days, again, just based on people's batteries in their cars. So, this is the future. This is what we're able to do, and that's what we're talking about.
Right. And so we need that technology, right? And that's the whole point and purpose is we need to advance being able to store, and not just through nights, but also through winters.
Right.
I think if we had that capability and the focus on that capability, that's the game changer. So ultimately, I completely agree with that, in that if we are able to collect the power, then that ultimately is going to be, and how do we collect the power smartest though? What is the energy mix that makes that most feasible?
Because we were talking about nuclear a few shows back, and that being a really beneficial technology.
And nuclear and volcanic, and we got into volcanic power a little bit.
Did we?
Yeah, we got into this portfolio of
Now how do
different.
volcanoes have power? Now I'm getting okay. Now you gotta go into it.
What?
She's on next.
Yeah, at 7 though, right? We're gonna edit this out, but at 7, right? Yeah. Okay. We're fine. We have at least a few more minutes.
No, I mean, usually she gets in at 6:30.
I know. Okay.
Okay,
We're
well,
fine.
she's good.
Okay, so picking up from your point, I know we're over.
Oh, you're good. No,
Sorry,
you're good.
Jeff.
You're totally good.
So picking up from your point, so we need, it's not just thinking about the future of energy and thinking about the different ways that we create with minimal sacrifice and with a portfolio that is still doesn't allow us to be vulnerable,
Yep.
right? Because the reason that you said that fossil fuels are so the reason that those are we're so reliant on fossil fuels is because we don't want to give up that consistent power. Can you imagine the U.S. being like India or Nigeria? Or I'm from India, so I can comment on India. Where growing up, I had to go and experience blackouts and what we called load shedding. And the idea was that you knew because it was something that the government did at a national scale, and they would just move blackouts from section to section throughout the country. And that's something, again, in addition to America not wanting to sacrifice on any sort of comforts that we've become accustomed to, we are not trying to lose electricity for any period of time, 1 hour to 5 hours. I would go for a good day sometimes without electricity because that's how the government controlled the limited amount of energy that it had to power the entire nation. We're not willing to do that in America.
Yeah, what's interesting is that I actually don't think decarbonizing doesn't jeopardize, in my mind, the security of the grid. It's not something where we're presenting to Americans, you might lose power. In fact, right now, PG&E is shutting down entire portions of California just because of fire risk. So it's climate impacts actually that are creating the blackouts, which is this irony.
So I have to ask you, because we're about to wrap up, we've got about 5 minutes left. I got to ask you some crazy stories on the Hill because, everybody that's out there listening wants to know, what's your craziest story? You've been in politics. You've been, what is it? Not executive director, chief of staff. For a high-ranking senator that's on the Intelligence Committee. You got to have some dirt for us.
Oh, you're back. So
We waited until the end until he had a beer in him.
There was a weekend where my wife's Uber had been hacked and was driving around Moscow. My Instagram had been hacked. The senator's wife and his son had been targeted. So I had to get on the phone with the Washington field office of the FBI to report this because this was prior to the election in 18. So we were running for re-election, and we were being targeted. And ultimately, I went and talked to the Washington field office. We had the Senate security officer brief us. The crazy thing was that they said is they thought there was the Russians probably had 100 people sitting in one room trying to
influence one senator from New Mexico.
Like everybody, all the senior people in his orbit, the kids, it was crazy.
Wow.
So like they go to extreme lengths, and I think that's one of the things that our current intelligence community has been warning us is that they're doing it again. Like this is like normal. This is not a revelation. This is normal course for what they do to try to influence elections, and ultimately what they want is like, what they call compromise, some sort of dirt on you that they'll, have.
Well, and it's
spread.
so crazy that we never hear about this kind of stuff. I mean, maybe I just don't hear about it because I'm from Kentucky and they probably don't target McConnell because he's, Moscow Mitch anyway. But, it's 100 people on one senator. Like that floors me because you never hear about that on the news.
Yeah, well,
Seems like there needs to be a PSA about that.
Yeah, avoid that. I mean, it's a strange environment, and that's they'll go to any length. So I think that's as a warning to Americans. We have an election coming up, and they're going to be active. And so the interesting thing in the last election, which is not classified or anything, but not everybody knows, is what they really sowed was discord. They wanted certain communities to hate other communities. They wanted a coalition of people to kind of be at each other's throats. So chaos and animosity was what they wanted. So they used, did they have an ultimate intent of helping the president? Yes. But it was like taking just kind of like cohorts of the democratic world and turning them against themselves. That was what they wanted. So like that was the means by which they stoked a lot of the social media.
So one more question before we end, because recently Sonny Perdue, the Secretary of Agriculture, had this big barn party, and he had all the ag groups involved. It was kind of a secret under the table thing. Politico covered it, and it was basically talking about climate change. Everything we've talked about today, very heavy Republican. Do you see the Republicans budging on something like the Green New Deal in the next 2 or 3 years, or at least coming to a compromise for something that might move forward?
They want to. They don't want to support the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal in some ways is like, it gives them a foil so that they can say we're against that, which helps them with their base, right? They need to be against something, but I think they are really, really interested in turning the tide. Like I said, the public is ahead of them. Even their voters are ahead of them. They want to find a way to be for something that is like conservation, environment, climate oriented. And right now what that is like, don't pollute the rivers with plastic and plant 1 trillion trees, all good things that we should be doing. But we need them to get more. We need them to turn the corner on climate change. And I think they want to. The real question, I was actually talking to a Washington Post reporter about this afternoon. They're struggling because anytime they stick their neck out, they get primaried and they get punished. And so they're trying to figure out, how do we do the right thing? How do we respond to this new generation of voters who, Republican or Democrat, is demanding it without being punished today? And so like unlocking that is in part what I'm trying to do. Like I want to go in and give them high cover. I want them to go in and have the farming community backing them up, having their local chambers of commerce saying this is the right thing to do. Thank you so much for your leadership. But we need those kind of, those odd coalitions all rowing together, because otherwise you just, you get the inertia. And the current inertia is they all know it's the right thing to do, but they have a base that is going to punish them, and without any other sort of kind of like help or support. That's kind of their calculation.
Well, Joe, you literally just started a conversation that is a new podcast, and as I can see Taylor wanting to ask you more questions, but we have to end it here for this time. But we'll have you back, and thank you so much for joining us and giving us all that insight. Remember, viewers and listeners, to please check us out every week. And if you have ideas for the show, reach out and tweet to us at Dr. Taylor Wallace, spelled exactly how it's pronounced, mine not so much, at Shwetac, SWETAC. And you can always reach both of us and the show generally at Risky Behavior DC. So thank you for tuning in to Risky Behavior, and until next time.